Well, I think maybe it's time for us to go ahead and get started. Just want to welcome everyone to this panel on sacred mountains, which is hosted by the California Institute of Integral Studies and the Ecology, Spirituality and Religion and Philosophy, Cosmology and Consciousness graduate programs. We're very excited to have three distinguished panelists who I will introduce presently. But before I do that, I would like to invite Elizabeth Allison, Dr. Elizabeth Allison, to step in and give our land acknowledgement.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging that many of us at the California Institute of Integral Studies, CIIS, are descendants of settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to the North American continent. And so in that context, we must educate ourselves on the history of the spaces we occupy. We must uplift and support Indigenous communities on whose lands we are, and we must uproot systems of colonial injustice that continue to this day. The CIIS campus building is located on the traditional unceded lands of Yalamu, which today is called the San Francisco Peninsula. The Ramaytush Ohlone are the original people of the San Francisco Peninsula, and Ramaytush is the Chochenyo word meaning people of the West. The Association of the Ramaytush Ohlone, ARO, is the nonprofit organization that represents the interests of the original people of the San Francisco Peninsula. ARO's objectives are the rematriation of their ancestral homeland, cultural revitalization, including language, research, consultation, and education to ensure accuracy in public culture and history, ecological restoration, and community service. We are very fortunate this evening that Gregg Castro of the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, ARO, is one of our panelists, and I'm delighted that he was able to be part of this panel this evening. This is very important. I, however, speak to you from the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area, where for hundreds of generations, the Lishan Ohlone people have lived on the land, nurtured the land, and belonged to the land. The land of Huichin in unceded Lishan territory includes what is now known as Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda, Piedmont, Emeryville, and Albany, California. So I'm speaking to you from the Huichin lands. As we discuss revering and honoring sacred landscapes, we are seeking to live in right relations with our human and non-human kin. Addressing historical wounds must involve care for both people and the natural environment. So I want to recognize the wonderful, brilliantly beautiful lands that the Indigenous peoples of California have cared for millennia, and express my gratitude that we are able to be on these lands today. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Elizabeth. I'm also joining in from Huichin territory here in Berkeley. So now I would like to invite our panelist, Gregg Castro, to offer the Indigenous welcome to the land.
Oh, there we go. Rishatuhi Shamasakish Mishistu Tisep Konha. Fotral Hek, Srumsen Hek, Ramaytush Hek, Recastro Tras, Takaksom, Leam Komplanek, Tukutnut Timitak, Hek, Benjamin Avila Castro Traso, Selenen, Ipach. Adelaide Alvarado Castro Traso Ohlone. Good evening, relatives. My name is Gregg Castro. I am Totral Selenen, Rumsen, and Ramaytush Ohlone, and come from the villages of Layam, Kuplanpak, Tukutnut, and Timitak, among others. And my parents are Benjamin Avila Castro, who was Salinan, and Adeline Alvarado Castro, who is Ohlone. And I'm very honored and pleased to be here tonight to welcome you virtually, and for those physically that are still within the homelands of the Ramaytush ancestors. Yelamu is what we now call San Francisco. The Ramaytush Ohlone speakers extended all the way down to near San Jose. And I am speaking myself right now from San Jose itself, which is the homelands of the Tamian Ohlone people, and wanted to honor and respect them as they are currently striving to take care of this part of the Ohlone homeland. I wanted to extend a thank you, Haitzpanikan, to everybody at CIIS for inviting me to this panel. Literally spoke minutes ago with my Salinan community, and we were talking about this very topic of our homelands and our sacred mountain, which I will probably be mentioning to you, and which at the moment is hiding right behind my head. And so we'll come back to that and talk about how important it is that others identify us by culture, by the things we do, the things we say, but we know ourselves to be identified by the place we come from. And usually that is associated with a sacred mountain. And so that is a very important topic to us, and I'm very happy to be a part of this discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Greg, so much for that beautiful message. And it's a perfect segue into an introduction to this panel. In case I didn't mention it, my name is Aaron Weiss. I'm a graduate of the doctoral program in Asian and Comparative Studies at CIS, and an adjunct faculty member for the philosophy and religion programs, including both ESR and PCC. And again, I welcome you to this panel on sacred mountains. So I'm going to just briefly describe this panel and its structure and order, and then move into our, I'll introduce our first speaker. Now, speaking of our first speaker, Dr. Edwin Bernbaum, in his book, Sacred Mountains of the World, wrote, "As the highest and most dramatic features of the natural landscape, mountains have an extraordinary power to evoke the sacred. Mountains are regarded as embodiments of humanity's highest ideals and aspirations. Of all the features of the landscape, mountains most dramatically inspire a sense of awe," unquote. From the gentle rolling hills of the Blue Ridge to the terrifyingly spectacular granite slabs of the Himalayas, mountains provoke a quintessential human urge to both define and be defined by the land out of which we emerged. And this reciprocal dynamic is generative, it's nuanced, and it's particular to place. And our engagement with this dynamic creates meaning. It's a tapestry of myth, culture, history, and tradition. It is a landscape. But our tendency to sacralize the link between inner and outer topographies does have a material significance. And with this premise, we must ask, what are the ecological implications of sacred mountains? And so this is what our panelists are here to discuss tonight with you. And so as we move into that, I'll just say that the basic structure here is that each of our panelists will speak for about 20 minutes. And during that time, you're welcome to submit questions for the Q&A period that will come after our panelists finish up. And you can just submit those by entering them into the chat. The chat function right now is set up so that just the event hosts receive those messages. And so I'll be keeping track of those. And when the Q&A time comes, I will present those to the respective panelists, all right? So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Edwin Bernbaum has recently published a second edition of his book, Sacred Mountains of the World, from which I just read, and will speak about his expertise with cultures and traditions that regard mountains as sacred. As a climber himself, Dr. Bernbaum will address how the features of mountain landscapes also influence the human perception of meaning and purpose within our endeavors, such as mountaineering, but also conservation efforts and the mitigation of climate change. And you can reach Ed's website at peakparadigms.com. So thank you again, Ed, for joining us, and please, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, let me start the share screen. Good. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm also honored to be speaking with the other panelists here on this sacred ground in the East Bay, South Bay, and the Peninsula. And I'd like to thank CIIS for inviting me to speak here. So I'm going to jump into, I'll be looking at sacred mountains very generally around the world. We don't have a lot of time to do it. So this will give us sort of an inkling of what I go into in much greater depth and more broadly in my book on Sacred Mountains of the World. So the title of my talk is Sacred Mountains of the World with the Implications for Conservation and Climate Change. And I'll be speaking a bit also about work I've been doing in the environmental area as the co-chair of the IUCN Group on Cultural and Spiritual Values of Protected Areas, and also work I did with the Mountain Institute, now known as the Instituto de Montaña. So in looking at mountains around the world, there are all sorts of ways to approach it. And the way I'll approach it here is that I think mountains evoke an experience of something of deeper significance or reality that gives meaning and vitality to people's lives. This, for example, is a view of a mountain called Ama Dablam in the Himalayas, not far from Everest. Now, people generally experience that something of either deeper significance or reality through the views they have of mountains. And I've identified 10 themes or views that are particularly widespread around the world. Often people will look for one particular view, like, for example, the mountain is a center or cosmic axis, and maintain that every mountain is sacred for that reason. What I found is there's incredible diversity and range of ways in which mountains are sacred. And even the word sacred is something that comes out of Western traditions. So that's often in different cultures expressed differently. But these 10 widespread views or themes, which we'll examine, they provide a framework for understanding the diverse roles that sacred mountains play in different cultures, and also a framework for applying it to conservation measures and also looking at the effects of climate change. So what I'll do very briefly here is give each of these themes with an example of a mountain that represents it, starting off with the mountain as a high place. And of course, the mountain that represents that perhaps most in the general world is Mount Everest, the highest mountain in the world. And I would say that Everest has assumed a kind of a semi-sacred status as the highest mountain in the world, because modern cultures tend to revere or give ultimate meaning or concern to whatever is number one, like the highest mountain in the world. And the mystique of this status attracts climbers, trekkers, and tourists to Nepal in particular. Now, it's interesting to note that traditionally Mount Everest is less important for the Sherpas and Tibetans who live near it. And that can be seen in the Tibetan name of the mountain, for which it's one of its names derives. It's known in Tibetan as Chomolungma or Jomolangma, which refers to the goddess of Everest, Jomolangma, who is a relatively minor goddess. She belongs to a category of Tibetan deities that are, what can one say, that are mundane. You appeal to them for mundane purposes, such as wealth, the long life, and so on. There are other mountains and deities that belong to a higher category, the transcendent deities, having to do ultimately with the goal of, in Tibetan Buddhism, of enlightenment for the sake of all beings. It's also known in Nepal as Sagarmatha, and that's the name of the national park in which it's found in Nepal, on the border with Tibet. Now, another very widespread theme that's very important is the mountain is center of the universe, center of the world, or center of a local community. And this is a mountain that perhaps embodies that more than almost any other. This is Mount Kailash, the most sacred mountain in the world, for up to 1 billion people in Asia, and also now in the West, and for followers of at least 4 different religions, including Hinduism and Buddhism. This is a view of Mount Kailash, which is lower than Everest, but much more important culturally and spiritually for the people of Asia. And it's supposed to be the physical manifestation of a mythical mountain at the center of the Buddhist and Hindu cosmology called Mount Meru or Sumeru, which rises 80,000 yojanas. That's more than 80,000 miles high and has its roots down in hell and unifies the different levels of existence. So it's known in Sanskrit as Kailas or Kailash, and its Tibetan name is Kang Rinpoche, which you see here. Now, another reason in which mountains are sacred in many cultures is they're places of power. And the power can be physical, as you see here, spiritual, or also political. What you're seeing here is the expression of Pele, the volcano goddess. This is Kilauea, with the lava flowing into the ocean, creating new land coming off of the sacred mountain of Kilauea on the Big Island of Hawaii. Now, mountains are also, and all of these themes kind of interrelate with each other, they're also very important as either deities or abodes of deities. So this is the highest mountain in India proper outside of Sikkim, Nanda Devi, which means the goddess of bliss. It's just under 26,000 feet high, perhaps the most sacred mountain in India proper. And as I said, the abode of the goddess Nanda Devi, who is actually a form of Parvati, the daughter of the Himalaya. The whole range of the Himalaya is viewed as a sacred, as a deity called Himalaya. And I should point out that sometimes mountains are abodes of deities and sometimes they are deities themselves. Now, also mountains are very important as temples or places of worship or communion with some higher power or some higher reality. And here you see Jerusalem, which is actually in the Bible a conflation of two sacred mountains, namely Mount Zion and Mount Moriah, which is the place where Abraham was said to have offered up Isaac. You can see here the three religions for which Jerusalem, which is viewed basically as a sacred mountain in the Bible. In the foreground is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third most sacred site in the Muslim world. In the background is the Jewish cemetery. And then on the Mount of Olives is a place where Jesus ascended to heaven after his resurrection, according to Christian tradition. Now, it's interesting that in Western monotheistic religions, mountains aren't worship themselves, but they are places of worship. So just as a church or synagogue is sacred, but you don't worship the church or sacred church or the synagogue as a sacred place, it's a sacred place because you go into it to worship and commune with something beyond it. So again, the diversity of ways in which mountains can be sacred. Another theme is the mountain, the idea of the mountain as a garden or earthly paradise. And what you see here is Mount Athos in northern Greece. This is a center of Eastern Orthodox Christian mysticism. And Mount Athos in the background rises above the Aegean on the end of a peninsula with 20 Byzantine monasteries, which you see along the slopes here. And the patron saint of Mount Athos and the whole peninsula is the Virgin Mary. So the monks who live here refer to Athos as the garden of the Mother of God, and they cultivate many, many gardens on this sacred mountain. Mountains are also very important as either ancestors or places of the dead. And what you see here is a major sacred mountain in New Zealand, Tongariro, which is especially sacred to the Ngāti Tuwharetoa tribe. And it's also very interesting in terms of the genesis of national parks around the world, because it was made into, the mountain here was made into a national park not too long after the first national park in the world was established, which was, of course, Yellowstone, which created a lot of problems in terms of, especially of indigenous peoples being kicked out and so on. Here, what happened was, for the Maori people, each mountain is very important because it's an ancestor or related to ancestral deities from whom each tribe is descended. And so it's a symbol of identity as well. And what happened here was, in the late 19th century, British settlers were coming in and they were they were buying up the lower slopes of the land to graze sheep. This was a great concern to the paramount chief of the Ngāti Tuwharetoa tribe or people. And he was advised that if the mountain got broken up into all these lots, the mountain would lose its mana and the tribe's sense of identity. So he did this arrangement called a tuku, in which the arrangement was made for joint responsibility for the mountain with the British Crown to be made into Tongariro National Park, which was officially designated in 1894. And it was the first national park in New Zealand and the fourth national park in the world. And the Maori have played a major role in the management of this park. Now, I mentioned identity. The mountain that probably expresses the sacredness of a mountain as a symbol of identity most is Mount Fuji in Japan, which symbolizes, among other things, the quest for beauty and simplicity that lies at the heart of Japanese culture. The perfect symmetrical shape of Fuji reflects that. This is a painting by Hokusai of a boy playing the flute, contemplating the perfect form of Fuji in the background. Mountains are also extremely important around the world as sources of various blessings, such as water, fertility, life, health, healing. And in particular, what you're seeing here are the San Francisco peaks in Arizona. They're sacred to 13 different tribes, each of whom have a different name for the mountain and a different meaning for it. The two major tribes for whom the San Francisco peaks are especially important are the Hopi and the Navajo, or the Diné. And you can see the Hopi name, Nuvatukgalbi, on the left, and Dokoslit, the Diné name, on the right. For the Hopi, the San Francisco peaks are the abode of the Kachinas, who are ancestral rain spirits on whom they depend for the rain that allows them to cultivate their crops on the Hopi mesas. For the Navajo, or the Diné, who have a pastoral way of life rather than a more sedentary agricultural way of life, the mountain is one of 4 mountains that are invoked in ceremonies of healing. So they're very much involved in the blessing of healing. And finally, a very widespread theme is the mountain is a place of transformation, revelation, inspiration, and renewal. This is a mountain called Huashan, one of the 5 principal sacred mountains in China and the most spectacular. And I'm going to read to you as mountains have inspired some of the greatest works of art in the world, especially in Chinese culture. And this is what one of China's greatest painters, Guo Xi, from the Song Dynasty around the 11th century, wrote of the value of mountains, landscapes, and also landscape paintings portraying mountains. The din of the dusty world and the confines of human habitations are what human nature habitually abhors, while on the contrary, haze, mist, and the haunting spirits of the mountains are what human nature seeks and yet can rarely find. And just another poem that I really like by Li Bo, who's one of China's greatest poets from the Tang Dynasty. This is a poem he wrote about mountains and what they meant to him. Up high, all the birds have flown away. A single cloud drifts off across the sky. We settle down together, never tiring of each other. Only the two of us, the mountain and I. This wonderful relationship between human and mountain in which they come together as friends. So let me shift now over to the environmental side. I was a senior fellow with the Mountain Institute, and I went to an environmental conference in Peru, and I was introduced to the director of an Indian institute called the G.B. Pant Institute. His name was Professor Purohit, and he acquainted me with the project they were doing at Badrinath. Badrinath is the major Hindu pilgrimage place in the Indian Himalaya. It draws people from all over the Indian continent up there. And the project was a reforestation project. So let me first start why I got interested in this. This is a painting of Shiva, one of the 3 forms of the supreme deity in Hinduism. And you'll notice he's supposed to be meditating on the summit of Mount Kailash in a beautiful garden, which you can't see with normal eyes, of course. And you'll notice on the top of his head is a woman's face with water spouting out. This refers to a very important Indian myth, which is very much alive today and which has very strong environmental implications. It's called the descent of the Ganges, or the descent of Ganga. Ganga is the goddess of the Ganges. And the story is this: there was a sage on the earth. The oceans were empty and he wanted to fill them up with water. So he asked the Ganges, Ganga, who was up in heaven, to come down and fill the ocean with their water. She didn't want to come down from heaven. So as an excuse, she said, if I fall to the earth, the weight of my waters will shatter the earth. At that point, Shiva stepped in and said, well, I'll break the fall of your waters with the hair on my head. So what happens is she falls on his head, and then he winds out through all the various rivers coming off the Himalayas that allow hundreds of millions of people to live on the parched plains of northern India. Now, Indian environmentalists have pointed out that this actually corresponds to what goes on, because the Hindu Puranas, ancient works of Hindu mythology, say that the forests of the Himalayas can be viewed as Shiva's hair. And when those forests are cut down and no longer there, then the monsoon is when Ganga falls from heaven in the form of monsoon rains during the summer. And if the trees aren't there to arrest the fall of her waters, you get devastating landslides and floods, and the earth does shatter under her impact. So I had sort of said, well, what about motivating pilgrims who come up to the Himalayas, motivate them to plant trees and take care of trees as a way of gaining blessings from Shiva, because that's one of the reasons that they're coming to the Himalayas. Now, in the case of Badrinath, it turns out there's a somewhat different myth that's used there, but the chief priest of Badrinath, called the Rawal, was very interested in doing something because the area had been forested until around the 1960s. India and China went to war around then, and India lost a big chunk of Ladakh up on the Tibetan plateau. So the Indian government and military put roads up into the border areas, including Badrinath, and this opened the area to mass pilgrimage. Before then, it had been a pilgrimage place for over 1,000 years, but only a few people were able to reach it after many weeks of walking up in the mountains. Now you get 300,000 to 400,000 pilgrims coming to this place in a period of about 2 or 3 months during the summer when it's open. And they had a major impact. The place was deforested. So Purohit was up there. And the problem was that there had been reforestation attempts by the Indian Department of Forestry and also the Indian Army, but nobody had taken care of the trees after they were planted. And so they all went bad. So he had the idea of going to the chief priest and saying, we can supply you as a scientific institute with saplings. If you'll bless them, we can reestablish a sacred forest, and then people will have much greater motivation for taking care of the trees. So this began a project called Badrivan, or the Sacred Forest of Badrinath. And I was invited to come up and observe what they were doing. So here, for example, is a tree planting ceremony where a Naga Baba on the left, Sri Hanuman Giri Giri, was blessing the tree sapling. This is one of the scientists from the Institute with whom I was working closely. And what had happened here, which was very interesting, was that the Naga Baba, who goes around in the All Together wearing a penis ring, he came and blessed the trees. And in addition, what happened was that he had gone up above Badrinath to about 15,000 feet in the winter, probably trying to go on his way to Svarga, or heaven, to die up high and then be reborn in heaven. But anyway, he just sat there in the All Together and let the snow pile up around him. And a military patrol came along and saw his holy man's trident sticking out of the snow, and they dug down and found him there. So one of the other speakers at this event, there were a number of different speakers, was the Indian brigadier general who was in charge of India's border forces with Tibet. And he said somebody like that was really worth getting darshan from or coming to see. So he brought along a band of people who were wearing turbans and kilts and playing bagpipes. And then there were the scientists speaking and the local priest. And I wound up being asked to speak myself. And I'm very honored to be in this group, but I must say the most unusual group of people with whom I've ever spoken was this event. So this is a project that was also of great interest because it was not only the holy people who were doing this, but the villagers were very interested in particular, the women. The women for various reasons. One is the women tended the cattle, And they wanted to have trees there because the leaves could be used for fodder and also for bedding for their cattle. And in addition, I spoke to some of the women and they said they wanted the trees there simply for beauty. So here is one of the local villagers with a sapling to plant. And then this got me to thinking, well, this is attracting people from all over India. And they're primed to get reasons for taking care of the environment, in particular trees that come out of their own traditions. And these sort of reasons make a lot more sense to people there than to say, well, you've got to plant trees because it's biodiversity that's needed, or very scientific reasons. But you have the potential, since people come from all over India, of reaching an awful lot of people. So I was with the Mountain Institute, and that sort of inspired me to start a program which we called the Sacred Mountains Program. This is obviously Yosemite Valley. And in the Sacred Mountains Program, what we did was we worked with U.S. national parks. We worked with the interpretive staff to develop interpretive and educational materials and activities that were based on the evocative cultural, spiritual, and aesthetic meanings and associations of different features of mountain environments in Native American, Native Hawaiian, mainstream American, and cultures around the world, as a way to reach out. And of course, people would be primed when they came to national parks to focus on the environment and to take these messages home. So what we were doing, in a sense, was going back to the origins of the environmental movement. This was our National Parks Partnership Project. And if you look at the origins of the environmental movement, which a lot of which happened here in California, and a lot of it came out of the writings of people like John Muir, Thoreau, and Emerson. One of the major reasons for preserving places in national parks was to preserve them as places to go to for spiritual and physical renewal, which is a major role of Sacred Mountains culture. And you can see this, for example, in the writings of John Muir, such as this: climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine flows into trees. The winds will blow their own freshness into you, and the storms their energy, while cares will drop off like autumn leaves. Now, we worked in a number of parks, and one of the parks we worked at was Great Smoky Mountains National Park on the border between North Carolina and Tennessee. And the mountains there are sacred to the Cherokee. And what you see here is a Cherokee elder, Jerry Wolf. And we used one of his quotes in an exhibit on 58 major national parks on basically the inspirational value of nature. And this is what he had to say: the Great Smoky Mountains are a sanctuary for the Cherokee people. We have always believed the mountains and streams provide all that we need for survival. We hold these mountains sacred, believing that the Cherokees were chosen to take care of the mountains as the mountains take care of us. The wonderful reciprocal nature of people and mountains and nature. Now, another project that we did at Great Smoky Mountains National Park was—
Ed, I just want to jump in really quick to say we're about 22 minutes in, so if we could maybe—
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Let me go quick. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So let me just go on. I'm sorry, I went a little bit too far. So yes, we did a series of wayside signs along a path that went from a visitor center into the Qualla boundary, which is the Cherokee ancestral lands in the town of Cherokee. And this was a collaboration between the Eastern Band of the Cherokee and the park. And the signs would relate features of the natural landscape to Cherokee stories and traditions, which were told in the voices of contemporary elders or storytellers as much as possible. And then used also in the Cherokee syllabary, which you see here. So this is a great model that could be done in all sorts of different places. So let me just, this was interpretation. What we've done since then is expand that through this International Union for the Conservation of Nature group that I co-chair. And we have a program called the Cultural and Spiritual Significance of Nature in the Management and Governance of Protected and Conserved Areas that were traditional people, conserve the area, not government. And this was a group, you can see our website here. What we've done is one of the first products of this was best practice guidelines on doing this. And they've now been published. And if people are interested, I can give you where you can download it. There's 6 general principles, specific guidelines, each guideline illustrated with a short example, and there were inputs from about 200 international experts and representatives of indigenous and other cultures. Now, the last section I'll just deal with briefly is sacred mountains and climate change. When I started climbing back in the 60s, I climbed this peak in Ecuador, Ilanisa Sur, and you can see it's heavily glaciated, or was then. I came back 40 years later, and this is what had happened to the mountain in the intervening time. And now 20 years more, it's even worse. And you can see what's happening with climate change. There's a sacred mountain not too far from Ilanisa called Cotacachi, which is sacred to the indigenous group of people in Otavalo. And the mountain has lost all its glaciers and all its snow. And they've taken this as meaning that the Mama Cotacachi, which is the deity of the spirit of the mountain, is angry with them. And they've hired basically shamans to invoke and try to ameliorate things, but they see it as something very bad. These are a couple of curanderos, or traditional healers from the Cusco area in Peru, whom I interviewed. And the one on the left is probably an Alto Masayo, which is the highest category. And these, they get their power to heal and diagnose through their relationship to apus, or spirits of sacred mountains. And the highest category of these curanderos are singled out and identified by being struck by 2 bolts of lightning high on a mountain ridge. The first bolt kills them, and the second revives them. Much more difficult to become a curandero than a doctor here in medical school. So the other example I'll just give is the Everest area. This is a lake that's forming below Lhotse, the 4th highest mountain on the peak next to Everest. And these lakes, they're being held by moraines, very loose, are a real threat to downstream in a lot of places in the Himalayas, also the Andes, because glacial outburst floods can happen. I had spent a lot of time with the Rinpoche, or abbot of Tengboche Monastery in the south side of Everest, whom you see here. And he was trying to arrest climate change because he felt the problem why we were having climate change is because people are no longer practicing religion the way they should. And he was making special vases called bumpas, which he would give to Sherpas to put in critical places of the environment, such as the summit of Everest and also at this lake, to try to arrest the change. He gave me this vase to bring back and plant somewhere in California, which we did in Tilden Park, surreptitiously going up with Lama Kunga, whom you see here as a Tibetan, and digging a hole in the ground, which you're not supposed to do in East Bay Park Regional District. This is just sort of the wider implications. This is Varanasi, the holy city of the Hindus, the most sacred city in India, and for many people in the world. And it's on the banks of the Ganges River. The glacier out of which the Ganges flows is retreating, and this has aroused a lot of anxiety and worry among not only religious devotees, but also environmentalists. And some of them have been trying to bring pressure on the Indian government to do something about climate change. In particular, India is the 2nd highest consumer of coal in the world after China. So if religious arguments like this with a Hindu nationalist government could have an effect, this could have a major effect on environmental change, not only locally, but around the world. So finally, I just want to finish with this picture of Machu Picchu and a quote from my book, and then we'll go on to the next speaker. For most of us, sacred mountains are remote from the experience of everyday life. What is the value then of thinking about them? It is simply this: the contemplation of mountains with their special power to awaken another deeper way of experiencing reality opens us to a sense of the sacred in our own homes and communities, a sense that we need to cultivate in order to live in harmony with our environment and with each other. In looking up to the heights and reflecting on the world around them, we discover within ourselves something that enables us to lead deeper and more meaningful lives. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Ed. I really appreciate that. I can tell you have so much more material behind that, so I appreciate you keeping it as brief as you could. Thanks so much. So now we will move to our second speaker, Gregg Castro. Gregg has worked to preserve his Ohlone and Salinan heritage for over 3 decades. Gregg is the Society for California Archaeology's Native American Programs Committee chairperson. A little bit of a mouthful there. Gregg is a facilitator for the annual California Indian Conference, a 30-plus year annual gathering about California indigenous culture. He is a founder and advisor to the California Indian History Curriculum Coalition, based at California State University, Sacramento, promoting accurate school curriculum. And he's the culture director for the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, advising within their San Francisco Peninsula homelands. Gregg is a writer activist within the California indigenous community, and he will speak about the activism he's been doing in this community over the years, protecting land and sacred sites related to his heritage. Welcome, Gregg.
Well, thank you once again for having me on this panel. And I'm going to speak generally about a few things, and then maybe get a little more specific in my personal and community's experiences on this topic. First of all, I think one of the issues that came to mind when Edwin was speaking is the wide diversity of viewpoints on sacred places, especially our sacred mountains, and how you describe them, how you view them. And one thing that occurred to me, and which has been occurring to me a lot lately, is one of the biggest barriers for Native people to discuss this is English. The problem is that our native languages have been developed for literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, and they're derived from location, from a place. So they're very specific to place, especially here in California. And so when we say the name of a place, it has a whole context and meaning behind it that other people wouldn't have any awareness of. And it usually involves a multiplicity of viewpoints and perspectives, not just one. So some of the aspects that Edwin talked about, 2 or 3 of them might apply to in terms of a place or a mountain for a particular Native people, as the entrance from the other world into this world, as the highest point, as the closest place to Creator, as a cultural site, as an important place of work, prayer and ceremony. These and other aspects are all possibilities, and multiple possibilities within an indigenous people's view of a place. From my understanding of being 30 years in this community and within multiple communities of California, having the honor and privilege of learning from them, is the idea of place. We are often described, and we talked about it at the beginning with our land acknowledgement and the welcome, the ways in which a lot of these people are described are actually identifiers from other people. We're not as often asked ourselves, how do we identify ourselves? And for those that still have the privilege to remember that through the cultural and physical genocide of the last couple of 100 years, the idea of who we are is almost always attached to a particular place, and especially an origin story that tells us how we came into a homeland and a place. In the 3 heritages that I am connected to, the Ramaytush, which I do most of my work in, is actually the most threatened and has the least left. And that's because San Francisco, Yelamu, was such a central place of colonization, such an early part of California history, and in the making of the Spanish Empire. It was thought of as a very important harbor, and that place was identified by the Portola expedition and people from the Portola expedition walking up to the top of a mountain, Sweeney Ridge as it's called now, and looking down and having Europeans first see San Francisco Bay from that vantage point, and seeing, not discovering it, but seeing that it was well occupied by literally hundreds of villages of Ohlone people, Ramaytush on the near side, Chochenyo speakers on the opposite side, and to the south by Tamian speakers. And so that relationship was starting to be changed from that very moment on. And it was obviously thought of in economic terms, that mountain and that vantage point, viewing the Bay Area as an ideal place for empire. And so they established themselves and brought in the local native people from their village sites, from their locations of birth and origin to Yelamu, to Mission Dolores. And the process of detaching ourselves from the origin spaces began. The imposition of Spanish as our language, and to eliminate the use of our language and then our use of culture. And here in Yelamu, it happened to a greater extent than other parts of Ohlone area and other parts of California, to where in Ramaytush land, we only have a very few of our words left. And none of our ceremonies that celebrated our origin places, that celebrated our sacred sites, and especially our sacred mountains, survived that. So we only have the knowledge of where we're at from and a few words left. On the other heritage of the Ramaytush, besides Ramaytush, is Rumson, which is the Monterey Bay area. And there we do have some knowledge of place, our origin site to Kootenai, our village up in Carmel Valley, at the foot of Pico Blanco, nearby, which is one of our origin sites. And to the south of there, my father's people, Salinan, which I've done most of my cultural work in, and what you're seeing behind me is a picture, which we as a community talked about whether we want that being viewed publicly, which is strange because it's part of a national forest, well known. It is known by other names. We identify it as Tatyokale in our language. Spaniards came and renamed it as Santa Lucia Peak. It now has another name, which we do not use out of respect to our ancestors who suffered in the nearby San Antonio Mission. And it is our origin place. We have lots of stories that talk about our coming into the world at the foot of that mountain. And the stories that describe not only what happened there, but why it happened. We came into the world the last of the first people, right? We often are called the first people, but we actually view ourselves as the second people in a sense. The first people were the first creatures, the powerful beings that Creator brought into the world to shape the world. And in the case of the Salinan people, the stories tell us that the world was reshaped by the first people after a flood. A very common theme in many of the stories along coastal California, even as far north as the border and beyond, down south. Our Ohlone relatives just to the north, they also have a origin story around the flood. And in our case, our sacred mountain, Tatyokale, was the only piece of land that survived, that you could see visibly after that flood. And it happens to be the highest mountain in the Santa Lucia range, a little over a mile high. And our stories tell us how the world was reformed from the first people that survived the flood and landed on Tatyokale. And from there, extended the powers given them by Creator, Katol Kenshanal, to remake the world the way it's seen today. And after that work was done through many stories and efforts and tireless challenges, then people were brought into the world. And we were brought into the world through ceremony that happened at the foot of that mountain, using things that were grown on that mountain. In our case, elderberry that was shaped into 3 shapes. And then the first people danced around that as they were taught and inspired by Creator for day and night and day again until they fell exhausted. And when they awoke, those 3 elderberry stick figures had come alive as 1 woman and 2 men. Our women like that story because they think that makes things even. And we men, if we're smart, agree with that. The idea then is that we are not just from a place, we are of a place. And that is very common for all the indigenous communities that I've learned from, that we are very made of that very place. And that is the essence of the attachment we have to our homelands. It is not the culture and the sacred traditions and practices that we do there. Those are very important aspects of who we are. But they come from the fact that we are of that place. And for most people, both the enrichment of who they are and the issues they have of who they are attached to whether or not they have access to that place, if they can visit that place, if they are still there in that place. And in many cases, we're not. In the case of the Ramaytush, we say that we are the first victims of gentrification, not just economic, but violent gentrification. We were literally pushed out of the area that gave birth to us. Some of my Rumsen relatives still live in the Monterey Bay area, but obviously the Rumsen area, just like much of Ramaytush, is very much changed and paved over in some sense. In the Salinan homeland, it certainly has been radically changed by ranching, farming, the modern accoutrements of modern life. US 101 goes right down the middle of our valley, Salinas Valley. And a lot of civilization has built up around that. But if you go into the mountains on either side, particularly to the west, where Statyoakale still resides, and it's now part of a national forest, that landscape has been radically changed. But I believe also that when I sit there at the foot of our mountain and I meditate and contemplate on the work that I do with my community, and we have ceremonies still at the foot of that mountain, I believe our ancestors from 10,000 years ago could look at that place and look at us and still recognize it as a place familiar to them. And that is incredibly important to us. And we feel very blessed in that way, at least in that place. It's recognizable. It's still a place we can go and reestablish and renew our cultural, emotional, mental, and especially spiritual relationship and tie to the place we came from. And that really is the center of culture for most indigenous people. Now then, going out into the world and talking about that, that's what makes it a challenge because, as I said earlier, English is the big barrier there. Describing a place, saying the word Statyoakale, which means that mountain behind me. That's the crude translation and definition. But there's so much context around that mountain. When we say Statyoakale, we have a whole image in our minds as Salinan people, as Totral, from that place of what that means. It's 10,000 years of history, perhaps as much as 15,000 years of history. We believe we came into the world at the dawn of the world, when it had just been renewed after the flood. And we were given that place with the sacred obligation, the sacred command, the sacred original instructions to take care of that place, right? The first people did so much work for us, and all we had to do was take care of it. If you've been a part of a family, and if you're the younger part of that family, as I had 2 older brothers. So I came in last in my family. And by the time I came in, my parents sort of had the parent thing figured out. We had a home. They had the economics figured out. I had food on the table. I had a place to play. I had a great neighborhood that I grew up here in San Jose, radically changed now. I just drove through it, and my home that I grew up in does not exist anymore. It's townhouses and modern homes. But I grew up in a neighborhood that remained intact, and I had a lot of people that I grew up with from before kindergarten all the way through high school. And when you have a place like that, and it's kind of like given to you, our culture and my family taught me to be grateful for it, right? I looking back on it, you know, other people might say I was poor, but I didn't see myself as that. I was incredibly rich because I had food, I had clothing, I had housing, I had a place, and I had friends and family and relatives and neighbors all around me who I had good relationships with. And that in essence describes the relationship that Native people and communities have with the place they came from. And a lot of the work we do now as Indigenous people is trying to maintain that relationship, those bonds to our creation place that are often a huge struggle for us, because in many places, instances, we don't have easy access, and sometimes no access at all, because somebody, quote unquote, owns that and has to give us permission. Mountain as a place of worship, not necessarily as a object of worship. And I think there's some duality there. You know, we view Statio as both. And again, English is the word that when we say that's a sacred place, some people think we worship that place, and that's not quite accurate. But on the other hand, we do view the world as, and everything in it, as alive. Even rocks, even mountains as alive. We have understanding now that the sacred mountains talk to each other. They communicate to each other in ways that we have little and most times no understanding. That's why the elders talk to us, say, go back to the mountain and sit there and learn. It's not about reading in books or hearing elders talk around a fire always, or hearing lectures where supposed learned people yak at you. Sometimes it's just a matter of sitting and viewing it, as I did when I took this picture behind me of our sacred mountain, and just letting it talk to me. And even if it's a language or a sound that I don't hear, it's still teaching me every time I go back. And that is what, to me, makes it sacred. And in a sense, makes me sacred. And we view everybody and everything as sacred. And for a long time, I think we were ridiculed for thinking that way, right? How could you view a rock as sacred? But now I think we can say with confidence, a lot of our people that know better, why don't you consider it sacred? So for us, what I learned early on from elders is that all viewpoints are valid, right? If you hear another origin story that says the world was created at such and such place, and we heard some of those stories from Edwin, many of those beautiful, wonderful places all around the world, right? Those places don't invalidate my understanding of Statio as being the center and origin of the world. We don't have that narrow-minded viewpoint, as I would say crudely, that my viewpoint is the only valid. They all have validity within the context of that person's existence. I was fortunate to be involved years ago for the California Indian Storytelling Association. And I remember two elders who were well known in California, but who had never met before. And they were sitting in the green room at a place where we were doing storytelling. And they greeted each other in their language and then identified their origin place to each other, which identified them, and told each other their origin story. And when one elder ended their story, the other elder said, "That is a beautiful story. It's a wonderful story. Let me tell you mine." And when he ended that story, the first elder said, "That's a beautiful story." So they validated and acknowledged each other. And that's a lesson I carry with me wherever I go, is in acknowledging sacred places, sacred mountains, sacred knowledge. It's all valid, it's all real, it's all true, and they all are connected because they talk to each other. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much for that, Greg. And it's an honor to hear these stories. We're deeply grateful that you shared them with us. So now we will go to our third and final panelist, Dr. Elizabeth Allison. She is the chair of the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program here at CIS. And she is an environmental social scientist whose research has explored the intersection of religious traditions with environmental policy and practice. And much of that research has been located in the mountains of Bhutan, where waste management practices, sacred sites, and cultural practices have all intertwined to respond to climate change. Her talk will be focused on sacred forests as sites of biocultural resistance. I just want to put in a quick plug for her website, which is elizabethallisonphd.com. So now, Elizabeth, please go ahead.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Ed and Greg, for these fantastic talks. I am just so appreciative and honored to be on a panel with you two who have both inspired me so much over the years. So I'm really grateful that you both agreed to be here. And everything that you are speaking about is so much of what many of us in ecology, spirituality, and religion are deeply, deeply interested in. So this feels like a very generative event, and I hope connections will continue to grow through this information. I would love to share my screen. Okay, here we go. And I think that, okay, so I changed my title a little bit. Sacred Mountains as Sacred Mountain Landscapes as Sites of Biocultural Resistance and Resilience. I think that based on where Greg left us a moment ago, especially about the mountain is still teaching every time I go back and the mountains speak to each other, I just have to say a little bit about my own origin story in relation to mountains. I didn't grow up anywhere near mountains at all. I grew up in the middle of the United States where it's totally flat. But the first time I went to the Rocky Mountains in southwestern Colorado, I just said, wow, like this is it. Here I am. This is amazing. Then during college, I studied in Nepal in the Himalayas and really became obsessed with mountain landscapes. What Greg just said about mountains teaching, I have definitely had that experience. I had some hard times in my younger years, and Yosemite took care of me. So I really thank you for that inspiration, Greg, and it solidified some understanding that I had in my own history. So then during graduate school, I went to Bhutan and did some of this research that I want to tell you about. Sorry, I need to change the screen sharing a little bit. Let me see here. Okay, anyway, onward then. So what I would like to tell you about is Vajrayana Buddhism in Bhutan and its relationship to sacred mountains, particularly as this relates to a figure in Vajrayana Buddhism named Guru Rinpoche, or Padmasambhava, who is believed to be the person who introduced Buddhism to Bhutan in the 8th century. And he is believed to have arrived on this high cliff wall on the back of a flying tiger, which was the form that his consort Yeshe Chogyal took for the purpose of helping him travel from from Tibet to Bhutan in the course of spreading Buddhism around the Himalayas. And these days, millennia later, this temple has been built there to recognize his introduction of Buddhism to Bhutan. It's called Paro Taksang, and it is a site of pilgrimage for both visitors and Bhutanese Buddhists. It's one of the most sacred sites in all of Bhutan. And in the course of studying in and with the Bhutanese folks and traveling around the country, I heard many stories about Guru Rinpoche's travels around the country. He's still understood as a living being. He's a presence in people's lives. They pray to him, they ask for favors, they say mantras and prayers every morning. And I became curious about the connection of Guru Rinpoche's stories and his life, the prayers, to the landscape in Bhutan, and how his travels across the country and his interactions with the landscape have contributed to a sense of sanctity in Bhutan. So first I want to locate Bhutan for you. It's in the Himalayas, in between China and the Tibetan portion of India. It's near Nepal, which we've already been introduced to today. It's an entirely mountainous country. You can see some of the relief on this map. So extending from peaks that are more than 7,000 meters or more than 20,000 feet tall in the northern part of the country, very steeply down to the southern foothills that are a few hundred feet above sea level, and then moving into India. And this very rugged topography has protected Bhutan over time from incursions from outside for the most part. There have been skirmishes on both borders with Tibetans and also with Indians. Most of the time, Bhutan has prevailed. It has had its territory chipped away over time. But this really rugged topography did not allow missionaries and colonizers and explorers from Europe to make much in the way of incursions into Bhutan. A couple Portuguese proselytizers came and offered to spread Christianity around Bhutan, and the leader at the time declined their offer, and they continued on to Tibet. But so in a large part, the topography and the natural endowments of Bhutan really limited outside influence. And that has created a very unique continuity of history and culture in this place. mostly because other explorers beyond the sort of Tibetan cultural sphere in this mountain area were unable to travel. And in the southern jungle area, it was very dense malarial jungle and very dangerous to travel through. There are tigers, there are still tigers today. So it was difficult for colonizers and settlers and proselytizers and missionaries to make much of their way into the country. I've circled the capital, Thimphu, in orange, and the location of the airport, Paro, in red. And these are the areas where the largest part of the human population is these days. Thimphu is the capital city. So you can see that those are on the western side of the country, and then much of the eastern side of the country is relatively less populated. And so I want to locate this talk in the field of religion and ecology, because that's what we do in ecology, spirituality, and religion. This is a scholarly field that has been developing since the 1990s, initiated by scholars in North America. And it explores the intersections of religious traditions with contemporary understandings of ecology, nature, and environmental issues, broadly understood. And as we heard in Ed's talk, some of the questions that arise is, are there ways that religious understandings might contribute to protecting natural features in the world, might contribute to protecting landscapes? How do people understand nature through religions, and what do religions say about nature? These are some of the questions that are raised. And one approach in this field is a method called retrieval, reevaluation, and reconstruction that looks at religious texts or rituals or stories and retrieves those that have environmental or content about nature to evaluate them in light of contemporary conditions and see if there is some teaching there, some information that could be valuable today in this religious context, and reconstructing these stories for contemporary times. And so that's the approach that I've taken with these Guru Rinpoche stories that I have been learning about and studying. I've seen that these stories and his movements across the landscape have four dynamics sanctifying the landscape of Bhutan. And so I'll talk through each of these, but to introduce them, first of all, Guru Rinpoche's travels around Bhutan and the Himalayas more broadly embellished or enriched the landscape through his hiding of sacred treasures in the landscape. These in the Buddhist tradition are known as terma, religious treasures that are hidden by Buddhist masters to be revealed at a future time and to provide teachings in the future. Secondly, Guru Rinpoche is said to have enveloped entire valleys in sanctity. These hidden lands are known as Bayu, and they are understood to be places of protection for Buddhists in times of danger. Some have said that the Khumbu Valley in Nepal could be a Bayu, that some have said that all of Bhutan could be a Bayu. So these valleys that can be, they're both mythical places, but also existing places in the present. And then Guru Rinpoche also energized the landscape by infusing meditation sites, caves, and rocks with powerful energy that continues to bless and inspire. I showed you Paro Taksang at the beginning. That is a temple built around the site where he is understood to meditate, and it emanates powerful energy from those rocks. There are other places all around Bhutan where Guru Rinpoche and other learned Buddhist masters are understood to have meditated and actually left impressions in the rocks. So this energizes the landscape and creates pilgrimage sites around the country. And then finally, he entrusted the landscape to spiritual protectors. He converted the autochthonous landscape dwelling deities to sworn protectors of the Buddha Dharma. And so this is a really interesting religious moment where oftentimes one of the world religions comes in and sort of stamps out or smothers the pre-existing religion. In this case, the local deities that are understood to be the original owners of the landscape were made sworn protectors of the Dharma. They had to swear an oath to Guru Rinpoche that they would follow the Dharma and protect the landscape. And so there's an interesting situation where Buddhism coexists with these deity beliefs that are understood to have pre-existed Buddhism. And then even the mountain protectors that we've heard about, mountain deities, they also became protectors of the Dharma and they swore an oath to Guru Rinpoche. So to talk through some of these dynamics with some examples, this is an image of Membartso, the burning lake in central Bhutan, which is the site of a very famous Terma revelation by Terten Pema Lingpa, who said that he was one of these treasure revealers, and people didn't believe him. And he said, well, if I can dive down into this lake and retrieve a burning lamp, that will prove that I am who I say I am. And he is said to have done that and also recovered spiritual treasures from this lake. So this is a site of ongoing pilgrimage. You can see the prayer flags up here. And many people, both Bhutanese people and visitors, tourists visit there. A number of lakes are known to be sites of Terma, and here's one in the highlands of western Bhutan in Ha, Nub Shonampata, where again sacred treasures were revealed. And then I mentioned Guru Rinpoche enveloped valleys in sanctity, identifying them as Bayu to be sites of protection in times of danger in the future. So this is an image of Bumtang, the Ura Valley in central Bhutan that's understood to be a Bayu. Some have said all of Bhutan, maybe Khumbu, Nepal. And so these are actual places, but people understand that they are spiritual sites and that they should maintain their best behavior and respect the spirituality and the sanctity of these places. Then I mentioned another aspect of Guru Rinpoche's sanctifying the landscape is energizing the landscape through his meditation and his travels to different sites. So this is a photo of a site where he's believed to have left impressions in the rocks from his meditation, and this small house is built to receive offerings and to honor the site. Paro Taksang is perhaps one of the most famous sites where he meditated. Another one in eastern Bhutan is called Gomkora. Ajane is to the north, and Pantokane is another place. But these places are all around the country. So the energetic power of Guru Rinpoche's meditation has touched these various places all around Bhutan. He's also believed to have empowered sacred waters at various sites, including this place in Gasa, northern Bhutan, where people will go and fill water bottles to bring home to stave off illness or low energy. A very popular pilgrimage place. And indeed, there's been over the last few decades a lot of study of these sacred sites, because many of them were just known locally and visited just by people in one particular valley. So there's been research all around the country to try to compile these sacred sites all around Bhutan, and these guidebooks can help pilgrims in Bhutan learn about their own sacred sites and the spiritual events that have happened there over the history. And then finally, I mentioned Guru Rinpoche converted the original autochthonous deities of the land into sworn protectors of the Dharma and entrusted them with promoting the Dharma and maintaining the sanctity of the landscape. So there are many sacred dances in Bhutan called cham that depict this dynamic where the local deities were subdued and then converted to protectors of the Dharma. This is an image of that. And again, these stories are conveyed annually in these dances for people to remember and learn and reconnect to this history. So a few examples of these sites where deities dwell. One is is the home of Drala Gulchang, a Ketsin or birth deity in central Bhutan. And this trail here leads up this hillside to some prayer flags where people will meet the deity for a certain ritual each year. The mountain continues up here in the clouds, but they're not allowed to go past the prayer flags because the deity is dwelling up there and does not want to be disturbed, but they do need to go up to the prayer flags and make some offerings annually to maintain good relationships with the deity. Here's another site in eastern Bhutan where these large trees have grown up where the abode of the deity is, because people feared entering this area. You can see that the forest is smaller and less dense all around, but this particular area in the center of the picture was home to a very powerful and dangerous deity where people were not allowed to harvest any wood or bamboo or anything. And as I mentioned, there's an intersection of the local deities with the introduction of Buddhism. So even at near a Buddhist temple, where this structure with a red band indicates that it's a Buddhist building, you can find an image of a Lu, which is a deity of prosperity and particularly associated with water. So they do get combined together. Here's another one, a spirit of a lake in Gasa Central Bhutan, Amanmo. People liken her to a mermaid, and she's the owner of this lake and protects basically the quality of the water, because people are not to disturb the lake or they will experience serious consequences: illness, crop failure, storms, hail, wild weather. And then the Lu is, as I said, a spirit of prosperity. So these small houses or lukang are built in the middle of fields to ensure that the Lu is happy and that it can maintain the quality of the fields and encourage a good harvest. At some points in the year, mountain peaks are closed. These folks are closing a mountain peak, and humans are not allowed to climb up and harvest bamboo or other wood or plants from the forest. And ecologists have pointed out that this allows the forest to regenerate during the summer growing season. And so it could have an ecological impact as well as honoring the deity of the mountain. So this chart just briefly summarizes some of the different deities and spirits that I've spoken about very briefly today. But the point that I'm trying to show is that there are a number of different deities and spirits, as well as religious figures that protect landscapes at a variety of scales, including entire mountains throughout Bhutan. And so my point about biocultural resistance and resilience is that this is an ontology and an epistemology, a kind of worldview that is quite different from the consumptive, commodifying worldview that is dominant in the West these days. And this is a worldview that exists right now. It's not something that has to be made up or generated. So I think that there's a lot to learn, even though we live in a very different cultural context. We also heard from Gregg about a worldview that's very different from the dominant mainstream worldview. These views hold the sanctity of nature. They identify different types of beings beyond humans and animals and beings that we can see, and suggest that there is value in venerating these different spirits and aspects of nature. So this is resistance to the dominating, commodifying worldview that is so prevalent today. And it's also a form of resilience in regenerating human inspiration, reverence, capacity, resilience over time. Many people, of course, go to spots in nature to be calm, to meditate, to practice religions, and the protection of these local spirits and the influence of Guru Rinpoche in protecting these sacred landscapes maintains the possibility of people being able to go to these natural sites to be renewed, to recreate themselves, and to experience reverence and beauty. So in a nutshell, that's what I wanted to share about sacred sites as sites of resistance and resilience. And thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that fascinating presentation. So much we could talk about there. Okay, so thank you really to all of the panelists. Really appreciate your concision and the passion and intelligence and learnedness that you are bringing to us tonight. So at this point, we are entering into a Q&A portion of the evening. We have a few questions that have been submitted so far in the chat, but not too many. So I think we can kind of open things up a little bit. Charlie, you and I were speaking offline about possibly opening up the Q&A so that everybody can see it. I'm open to that. We've got about half an hour left, so I think we can just kind of develop a conversation here. Maybe I'll start by reading what's been submitted so far. I'm sure I can come up with some questions. I've translated treasure-based manuals and learned a little bit about bales and naics and these various kinds of Himalayan phenomena that are relevant here that we could gab about into the night for sure. But anyway, let's start with a question from the audience. We have Craig here, who put together a couple of questions for our respective speakers that kind of deal with bringing this theme into relationship with some of the more kind of urgent issues that we're working with today. So he said, this was at 6:57, so maybe he was talking to Gregg here. He said, can you talk about the tension of modern life and the economic equations that destroy nature, and the generations that you've lived under the rules of sort of colonizer society and its dysfunctions? I'm not sure exactly what the question is there, but there's this, again, the question of tension. And then I think he had a little bit more of a point here with the second question that he put in, particularly to you, Elizabeth. So I think any of our panelists can respond here. He said, what is the relevance today in the Western world, which is destroying the planet in so many different ways? What is the takeaway when we're talking about these Himalayan practices for Americans. So you did develop this towards the end. This was a question that he submitted earlier on. But the question is about the social relevance of these practices and beliefs outside of a Buddhist context or a Himalayan context. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that, either one of you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I understand the question, that it may seem not especially pertinent to be talking about the practices and worldviews of people who live half a world away. But I think we heard very clearly from Gregg that these people don't live half a world away. They're also our neighbors. And I think that the modern Western commodifying industrial worldview tells us there is no alternative. This is the way things are. You are caught in this. You cannot get out. There are no other options. If you try to think differently, you're crazy, you're insane, you might be committed. And what I want to suggest is, which I think Gregg also did very, very clearly, is that none of that is true. There are people living in this worldview right now. And I think it's important to study simply to learn more about other cultures that share the world with us that are quite different. There's just so many different ways of being in the world. It's important for a cultural conservation or cultural protection point of view. Gregg mentioned the loss of indigenous languages in California, and that's a concern around the world. Many smaller languages are disappearing, and with that disappearance is a whole way of knowing and understanding the world, and a whole set of knowledge that's carried within those smaller languages. In the Himalayas, there are sometimes languages that are spoken just in a couple valleys because the peaks in between are so steep and people don't travel that much, or historically didn't. So there are ways of knowing and worldviews within these languages, but which are now also being shared more broadly through in Bhutan, through education and tourism and these handbooks about sacred sites that I mentioned. But I think that it shows us that there is an alternative to industrial growth society that doesn't necessarily have to be invented out of whole cloth. Like, here's one that exists right now. And it exists alongside iPhones and computers and laptops. And people use all of those things. And also they pray to Guru Rinpoche, they go to these sacred natural sites, they protect these sacred sites. So I'm not saying that it's the way, but it's, I think, very instructive to learn about other ways of doing things and consider in what ways they could inform our own practice. And I think, again, I would like to connect back to Gregg's talk, where he talked about protecting sacred mountains here in the Bay Area. In particular, Yokali, just wanted to check the name, as well as I know that the Amamutsan travel band is working hard to protect their sacred mountain in the South Bay. And so these are current crises that allies can support if we wish, if we find them to be interesting and relevant. I personally do. I think that the flourishing of human life and non-human life is much more interconnected than we presently understand. And we are destroying non-human life at our peril. And to learn more about that, you should come to my interview with Merlin Sheldrake in May. He's written a marvelous book about fungi that I'm going to interview him about, but his book, Entangled Life, makes that case very, very strongly. So those are some thoughts. I would love to hear from others. Thanks.
Well, I was just going to add to what you said in terms of the Bhutanese influence on worldviews outside of Bhutan. Something that the Bhutanese have developed out of Buddhist ideas is the idea of gross national happiness instead of GDP. And this has gotten the attention of a lot of people outside of Bhutan and makes a lot of sense. It's maybe difficult to quantify, but on the other hand, it is bringing in not just the economic measures, but in what ways does development or whatever you're doing contribute to human well-being? And human well-being depends, as the Buddhist tradition very clearly says, and also the indigenous traditions here in the Bay Area, on people's relationship to the environment and to other creatures and to the land itself. And we've cut off those relationships. What we were trying to do in a lot of our interpretive material with national parks was expose people to different points of view that might be quite different. But the idea was, here is the way Native Hawaiians see mana. What do you see? As a way of kind of getting people to look back into their own traditions and into their own way of thinking. And it turns out, even in the modern Western world, a lot of it comes out of older traditions that are in religious texts and so on. So that I remember I started off, my Sacred Mountains book came in part out of an all-day seminar I did at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And I started off the talk by saying, well, you may think you're very far away from any sacred mountain here in Washington, but just up the mall is Capitol Hill. And the model for Capitol Hill, where the laws come from, is Mount Sinai in the Bible. And I said this sort of off the top of my head. Well, one of my sons went on a school trip from Berkeley High to Washington, D.C., and they went into the Capitol, and there in the chamber of the House of Representatives, around the ceiling were portraits of famous lawgivers, and the one in the center was Moses with the tablets of the law on Mount Sinai. So you start to realize, yes, that's also in Western tradition, but we've kind of overlooked it. How can we revive this sort of thing?
Ed, while we have you, you made reference earlier to a packet or guide that people could access. Could you repeat that? What was that?
Oh, it's best practice guidelines on basically on integrating the cultural and spiritual significance of nature in general, not just mountains, into the management and governance of protected and conserved areas. Protected areas are sort of government areas like national parks. Conserved areas are places that are being conserved and protected by indigenous and local communities. So it's pretty broad.
And so where is that available?
It's let's see, I'll have to find it. It's well, one of the ways you can do is go to our website for the www.csvpa.org, and then you'll see in there's an area that talks about cultural and spiritual significance of nature program. And if you go into there, it'll eventually take you to where you can find a place to download a PDF, and it's available for free. But it basically looks at in a very general way. And one of the things I really liked about what Gregg said is, there are all sorts of different ways that you can respect. You don't have to have, just one way, which is the way that everybody has to accept. Especially like your story, Gregg, of one person saying, well, that's a beautiful story. Here's my story. And exchanging these things. And that was very much what we were trying to do, this sense of respect. So we're looking at, in this best practice guidelines, it's looking at nature in general and looking at, various different ways in which views like have been in Bhutan and what Gregg was talking about here in the Bay Area and in other parts of the world, how that can be used to basically involve and motivate and help protect places for indigenous cultures, mainstream religions, and also the secular general public. Because in a way, places can be sacred. I mean, for example, a lot of us go hiking in the Bay Area hills or go up to the Sierra Nevada. We may not be religious and we may not believe in any deities or any of the sort of things, but you go into nature and you feel a sense of awe or wonder. And in that sense, even from a secular point of view, nature can be sacred.
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth mentioned something about the languages in Bhutan, and very similar to what happened here in California. California, historically, before contact, is thought of as one of the most diverse language places on Earth in the history of man. And it was because of the similar situation of geography, not just pure isolation, but the fact that California was so bountiful that people didn't need to move to follow resources. They needed to just get up, walk out of their hut, and walk a couple of yards, and food was all around them. And so, that really generated a different attitude, and especially in terms of humility and gratitude for the place they were given, and formed and shaped their spiritual values around that place. So one of the things you kind of mentioned is, in this modern world, do you have to go out into the boondocks to find sacred places? And actually, some of the work I do in the Lonely Country, especially in San Francisco, is maintaining cultural sites. And the basic question that comes up is, just because it's paved over, does that mean it's not sacred anymore? And of course, to me, that's a nonsensical question. It's like throwing a blanket over your grandmother and saying, is grandma gone? No, of course not. It's just covered up. But the essence of that place is still there. And in some cases, it's grandma's been taken to the old folks' home and severely abused and ignored and not visited. And now you found grandma. Grandma was lost for a while. Now grandma's back. Grandma is in your sights now. What do you do with grandma? You take care of it. You take care of her. You take care of the place and help it restore itself to its own sacredness. And to me, that's the essence of this term that's is being used nowadays, called rematriation. It's often used in the context of our women folk who are doing a tremendous job and are really the leaders in bringing back culture, spirituality, sacred places. Karina Gould, I was just with her just at the Pioneers just a few days ago, where we were talking about the work she's doing protecting the Berkeley West Shell Mound, because it's still sacred, even though it's paved over with crumpled asphalt, but it's still there. It's still sacred. The same thing with our sites in San Francisco. The essence of their sacredness still remains, and they still has value. And often the challenge and the barrier is communicating to others who just see it as asphalt, as concrete, as a barren field with weeds. And to us, it's still sacred. One of the things that they talk about at the Pioneers and is becoming more popular around the world is the rights of nature. In the trying to communicate in crude terms the native thought and spiritual belief that nature itself is a living being that is equal, if not superior, to us. And so it's not like we're giving its rights back. We're affirming its right to itself to exist the way it's meant to exist. The last part I wanted to say was the idea of indigenous knowledge that we've gained over thousands of years of just hanging around and being in direct connection with these sacred places, and how that was dismissed by European colonial culture and society in order to take over these sacred places and subjugate them. Now what's happened, and it took both a pandemic and a climate calamity here in California with the wildfires, now flooding, and now water shortage, to understand there's a different way to view things. And what we're seeing is individuals, agencies, organizations, and now the government itself is coming to Native people and asking us the open question: what do we do? How do we take care of this place that's been taking care of us? And they're just realizing that. So that is a new thought process for us to try to work with. And of course, we've been depleted of our own resources to be able to help others, even to help ourselves. So that's part of this process that we're trying to scramble to do, of gather ourselves, of having the financial withdrawal that we can do this work that we want to, need to do in a way that sustains our families so that we can do it. So that's ongoing work for almost all Native communities in California that I'm aware of. Very few, despite the C word, that not many communities really have wealth. They're all struggling in their own ways, and especially financially. And so supporting them, especially in the urban areas, so that we can do the work we were brought into the world to do, is still very important. And then the last thing I'll say, and I put it in the chat, shameless plug for my own event, the Exploratorium on April 22nd, just a short time away. You will be able to see culture bearers from all throughout North California, the finest culture bearers, who are, and we're going to talk about nature, ecological restoration, because that directly affects their ability to do the crafts and cultures that you're going to see demonstrated at the Exploratorium that day. Basket weavers, carvers, all of these culture bearers are directly impacted by this ecological crisis we're going through. And they're going to talk about just last few years, how radically the landscape has changed because of it. And so there's going to be panels and then tables where you're going to see these people demonstrating their crafts, that they're some of the best in the world.
That sounds great. That's really exciting.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for all these responses. I see some other questions have come in. It looks like, Greg, you were right in tune with some of them and answering them without even needing to be asked. Certainly not surprised. I appreciated Matt Switzer's question, which is, in listening to each other, are there any questions that the panelists might like to offer each other, or particular kind of back and forth that any bookmarks you made in your notes as each other was speaking?
I had a question for Ed, if I may. I was really inspired by his first edition of Sacred Mountains of the World, and I wondered what was notably different when you went to revise it for the second edition.
Well, thanks very much for the question. The first edition was published back in 1990, so a lot has happened since then. And as a result of writing the first edition of the book, I got involved in working with the IUCN and the Mountain Institute on basically, I was invited to give a talk at a conference in New Zealand on mountains. And so I gave a talk on the policy implications of sacred mountains for environmental conservation. And then one thing led to another. So to answer your question, first of all, the second edition is in a very different format from the first edition. The first edition is a large format with about 120 color photographs, which is very nice. But the problem is, in the United States in particular, we tend to put things into boxes. So since it had the appearance of a coffee table book, people treated it as a coffee table book and didn't pay that much attention to the text, which is 180,000 words, which is a lot more than most books. So I was really interested in doing another version which would focus on and highlight the text. And actually, Mount Kailash played a role in that, interestingly enough, because I was working on a project to get Mount Kailash in Tibet nominated as a World Heritage Site with an organization of scientists from all over the Himalayas based in Kathmandu called IUCN. And they assigned somebody to work on this with me, an Indian fellow, very, very bright. He'd done a degree at Cambridge University. His name is Abhimanyu Pandey. He's now finishing up a Ph.D. at Heidelberg, doing research on Spiti up in the Himalayas. And so we became very good friends, and a very, very bright, very competent person. So we stayed in touch after we both left this project, and he went back to Heidelberg. And he casually mentioned in an email that his brother was just finishing up a Ph.D. at Cambridge. And he had a friend there who worked for Cambridge University Press and was a fan of my book. So I contacted him. He put me in touch with an editor. And so the second edition, as I say, it has about 24 black and white pictures, all of which are new, converted from color. But the difference is there were a number of mountains that I hadn't been to when I wrote the first book, the first edition. The second edition, I've included a lot of research and also experiences and anecdotes from mountains that I managed to go to after I'd written the first book. So it enlivens it up. I've also added new mountains that weren't in the first edition, and then a lot of material on the work we did with national parks, and also I alluded to it very briefly, what we've done with cultural and spiritual significance of nature, and also a new section on sacred mountains and climate change, which I touched on a bit in my talk. So the book has quite a bit of new material, and I also broadened it out. There's a chapter, for example, on the spiritual dimensions of mountaineering. So I included a lot more, and I also brought in a lot of women's voices in climbing, which hadn't been there in the first edition. So that was another change by it. Incidentally, as long as you have me on here, you mentioned that you came from a place that was very flat, and then you saw mountains and were really inspired by them. The way I got into this is my parents were in the Foreign Service. So my earliest memories are from when I was 2 years old or a little after. We moved to Quito, Ecuador. So my earliest memories are snow-capped peaks on the equator. And I came back and I fell in love with snow. We came back to Washington, D.C., and there was something magical about the way snow transforms the landscape. Everything becomes smooth and mysterious. To me, it was sacred, although I wouldn't have put the word on that. And we moved back to Ecuador later on when I was a teenager. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be neat to go up to snow on the equator? So somebody put me in touch with an Ecuadorian mountaineering club. And I really got into climbing with Ecuadorians. So it was a cross-cultural experience right there. And it was very interesting because I was also climbing in college with Americans. The difference in attitudes between the Ecuadorians, who were much more into the camaraderie and having a good time and being with people, and the Americans who were really focused on accomplishing things and doing stuff. That really struck me. And then I went to Nepal with the Peace Corps and got caught in a huge avalanche on Annapurna. And basically that led to a lot of insights and what can I say, insights and so on that really informed the work I did. And you mentioned Bayouls and Hidden Valleys. My first book was on the Tibetan myth of Shambhala, and also included, which is a hidden kingdom, and included a chapter on the Bayouls or Hidden Valleys. You mentioned them when you talked about the tertons and the termas. In a sense, the Hidden Valleys are the biggest termas or treasures that Guru Rinpoche hid away. And there are guidebooks to them. There's one that's supposed to be that I went on an expedition looking for east of Everest called Kembalung. And then actually the original site of Kembalung may well be in Bhutan from the point of view of the tradition. As a matter of fact, I had a dinner the first time I went to Bhutan with the foreign minister of Bhutan, and he told me he grew up in that Bayoul. So, yeah.
Yeah. Francois Pomeray, a French anthropologist, just went on an expedition looking for it. Yeah. And she's working on some writing right now on that.
Yeah, and the whole country of Sikkim is considered a Bayoul. Mm-hmm. And there's a guide, it's called Bayoul Demojon, the Hidden Valley of Rice. So, yeah.
Something that's interesting about the idea of Bayoul is that, I mean, it's not just that people didn't realize there was a valley there and then the Tertone revealed it as if it was just like a geographical discovery, but rather that its particular sacred power is what has been revealed. And that's sort of there's this intertwined function with the revelation of Terma treasures, etc. And so these nayiks, or these guidebooks to these pilgrimage places, are sometimes helpful in actually producing these sites as sacred. And that kind of leads me into a question about the sort of kind of fixed versus portable nature of these traditions. I think you've been touching on this already, that these part of what's relevant, I guess you could say, about this discussion about learning about these things is realizing that there are kind of indigenous ways, you could say, of revealing the places around us as sacred. We might not realize that we are inhabiting sacred or potentially sacred sites, as you know, wherever we may be. So it's about 7:58. I think we've got maybe 2 minutes if there's any really urgent, quick questions. Otherwise, maybe we can draw this auspicious evening to a close.
Well, I'd just like to add something to what you just said, which is in the Bayul tradition, there are 3 levels of a Bayul. There's the outer Bayul, the inner Bayul, and the secret Bayul. And you may be in the physical outer place, but you may or may not be aware of the other deeper, more important levels of the Bayul, which corresponds to what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. And it seemed like Gregg was pointing to that in a different cultural tradition, but a sort of a parallel idea of going and sitting with the mountains and listening to them. So I don't want to ever collapse cultures, but there do seem to be some like parallel dynamics in cultures.
And I think it's important to know when you do sit there, you start off in, whether you know it or not, negotiating with the place. And it's going to evaluate whether it's going to reveal itself to you and how much, and maybe like meter it out, or a more modern term might be trickle truth you. So you have to go multiple times, depending on where you're at, because sometimes it can be traumatic. Whether you're an indigenous person who's coming back to their origin place, or somebody else who's really connecting with nature for the first time. But it can be traumatic. So sometimes the mountain understands that and goes, here's enough, chew on this for a while, come back later.
Right. And I think the Chinese poem I quoted by Li Bo expresses something, in the Chinese tradition, which, is maybe a little bit similar to yours, where he talks about, the mountain and I are with each other. And he's there listening. He's having actually a friendly relationship with the mountain, treating the mountain as another being with whom he relates. Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I guess that is the glimpse that we've been offered tonight. So thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thanks to everyone who came. I can see this presentation, this panel was recorded, so presumably it will be posted somewhere. I don't know if maybe Charlie or Elizabeth could speak to that. So hopefully you will be able to access this again. And please do take note of the URLs that were put in the chat by our presenters for the different websites they have and the events they have coming up and materials that they have on offer. I think that's it for now. Thanks so much, everybody.